All right, now it's as good of a time as any. So am I unmuted? I'm unmuted. All right. Good afternoon, UCLA community, and welcome to the fourth week of the New Ventures Business of Bioscience Bootcamp. This is a bootcamp and webinar series that we're offering this fall on the minutiae and the details of what it takes to get your technology translated from the benchtop into the commercial space. So thank you again for joining us this week. Just to review, we've already had 3 weeks of seminars so far, pitching life sciences, indication prioritization, and managing risk and with risk up front. And this week we'll be joined by Sabrina Varaneli, CEO of Nemedio, for the pre-compliance journey. Next week, we will be taking the week off and we'll be coming back again on the 17th for better understanding of the basics of licensing university IP to a startup. So once again, we're here joined by Sabrina Varaneli, CEO of Nemedio, who will be talking to us about the pre-compliance journey, or as you probably understand it, the tasks for getting your medical technology ready for regulatory approval. Just like every week, we have the Q&A function available, so submit your questions as they occur to you, and we'll be answering them throughout the presentation. And we'll also allot some time at the end of the presentation for Sabrina to interact with you more fully. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sabrina to introduce herself and to introduce this topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. Hi, everybody. Like Matthew mentioned, my name is Sabrina Varaneli. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Nemedio. And today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is how to make sense of the medical device development process, which is, the more practical title is all of you are likely in an R&D tech transfer type of phase right now. And so our goal today is to learn how to think about compliance while you're in this R&D phase, and what types of compliance activities you can do now in order to maximize your chances of success as you're going through this technology transfer journey. So, background wise, just to introduce myself, my background's actually in robotics engineering, and I started working in the defense industry before moving into the medical device space. And throughout, all of my career, I kind of was always trying to do this cutting edge, innovative technology in these industries, defense and medical, oil and gas, aerospace, stuff like that, in these industries that had lots of red tape. And so essentially the idea behind Nemedio is that we provide, solutions to allow companies to bring mission critical products like medical devices to market faster, cheaper, and more efficiently. And we do this by introducing this concept of pre-compliance. So it's compliance activities that you do before you're ready for full compliance in order to prepare you for this transition. And so you don't have to, just go from flip the light switch and try to be compliant overnight. I can go to the next slide. So what usually happens during the medical device development process is that companies only focus on R&D. So right now you guys are heavy into R&D. You're really working out the kinks and the engineering aspects of your product. And what usually happens is companies completely ignore compliance at this point. They say, oh, we'll just hire a consultant later. And what ends up happening is during the proof of concept and prototyping phase, if you avoid doing any compliance work, you end up saying, okay, we're ready for a clinical study. I'm going to go hire a consultant. They're going to come in and tell me what to do for compliance. And they come in, they take a look at all your documentation, and they say, you're not even close to being ready for this clinical study. Go back and do all of these changes. And a lot of those changes end up being engineering changes, not just paperwork changes. And so what usually happens to early stage companies that we see is that because they don't do any compliance at the beginning, they get these activities when they're kind of running out of money, trying to raise a Series A, and the companies end up running out of cash while they're doing all of this engineering work. And when they then try to go out and fundraise, and it's ridiculously hard to fundraise at this point because you haven't really done enough compliance stuff to bring you to the next level and to reassure your investors. And so this is kind of what we call the valley of death, where companies, often great technologies and life-saving technologies that have really good, fundamental science and really good, innovations behind them, they end up dying during this commercialization process because they failed to work on compliance early enough in the process. So, if a company does end up raising money, then you go through and you actually get compliant, you go to market. But this process is kind of a very, not the most efficient way to get your product to market. So what we propose instead is this concept of pre-compliance. So as you're working on your engineering and product development activities during your proof of concept and your prototyping phases, you're doing some activities to de-risk what you're building. And the idea behind these activities is that they're the activities that directly impact the product that you're building. So you build the right product the first time. So again, it's not about documentation and paperwork. It's about getting all of the requirements you need to engineer the right product the first time. Then what we like to recommend people do is actually go and meet with the FDA. So you actually submit a informational packet to the FDA and have a meeting with them, more on this later, but you basically will have a meeting with them, and this becomes the first compliance milestone that you meet. And after this pre-submission meeting, you walk out of this meeting with the FDA with a very clear and concise plan of how you're gonna continue transitioning to compliance, continue doing your testing, continue doing your clinical studies, and how you're going to actually get your clearance later on. And we find that investors respond very well when you go to them and you say, hey, here's what we did with our first 250, 500K investment from our technology transfer office. We had a pre-sub meeting with FDA. We did all this compliance stuff. We're now very confident that if you give us another $5 million, we can get through clearance and start selling product. And we find that investors respond really well to this type of approach. So this is what we recommend companies follow in terms of their life cycle. So this is, so today we're going to talk about what these pre-compliance activities are. And first, I'm going to talk about this pre-submission meeting. And this is we're working backwards from this pre-submission meeting. So all of the activities we're doing during pre-compliance kind of culminate in having this meeting with FDA. And during this meeting with FDA, you essentially hand them a package of information, which we're going to talk about what goes into that. And you confirm with FDA and say, hey, FDA, we've done all this risk analysis. We've made our device really safe, or we're continuing to build our device in a very safe way. Here's the testing that we plan to do. And do you agree that we're doing all the right stuff so that when we finally give you our submission, that you're actually going to look at it and you're going to give us our clearance or approval that we're looking for? And I think just a note on timeline is this meeting is not something you can just request of FDA and schedule overnight. It's a 3-month process where at the beginning of this 3 months, you actually submit the documentation to FDA. Then they'll go back and forth with you over a period of 90 days. And then you'll actually have the meeting 3 months later. And there's like a process of, making sure that you submit notes and minutes and that you both agree on it. And, you come out of this having a very clear picture of what FDA is expecting of your product. And it's the kind of meeting that you don't want to necessarily mess up the first time you do it. It's your first impression with FDA. And so what actually happens during this meeting is during this 3-month period where they're reviewing your package of information, they're actually forming the committee of people who will be clearing your actual product later on. And so, it's a very, it's an experience that makes it so you're building up this relationship with the actual reviewers as early as possible. And you're kind of establishing those connections. And, they give you their business card, they give you an email address, and now you can just email them and ask them questions. So it's really about opening this channel of communication and getting this nod of approval to your plan as early as possible, which in turn is good from a business perspective because it allows you to understand, how much money it's going to take to do your clinical testing, how big your sample sizes of your clinical studies need to be, and things like that. So this is the goal that we're working towards as kind of, the final piece of pre-compliance. So when it comes to actually figuring out what to put into this information packet and what to do right now, we first have so we first have a diagram that I want to go over. So the way that I like to think about this diagram, this is kind of the Nemedio method. So this is our interpretation of the very complicated regulatory approval process. And this diagram that you're looking at here is a simplified version of what is actually a very massive diagram for full compliance. This is like, the training wheels version that you should be thinking of at this time. So the end result here, remember, is that we have 2 end results. One of them is to go to FDA with a plan of how we're planning to test our device and push it through from a submission perspective. The second important thing here is that we give the engineering team a full list of requirements to build to. So that again, you build the right product the first time. You're not building a product with no compliance input and then hiring a compliant consultant to come in and say, oh, you engineered your device wrong. You need to follow all of these rules and regulations. Go back and redo your engineering activities. It's most important from an engineering perspective, from a cost perspective, from a get to market perspective, that you have this list of requirements, and these requirements get fed through a lot of different channels. So the biggest channel has to do with your indications for use, which is how you're using your device. You then derive user needs, they feed into your requirements, you do some risk stuff, feed into your requirements. So we're going to go through each one of these boxes individually in order to understand the stuff that we should be doing at this time. So we're going to start with the regulatory strategy plan. So the regulatory strategy plan is a document that basically describes the overall path towards approval. So this is when you should really, first engage a regulatory specialist or a regulatory consultant and get them involved with your program. They will help you identify the approval pathway, the standards or guidance documents and regs that you're required to meet based on the type of device you have. They're going to help you set up your plans for your FDA meetings. So the first meeting will be this pre-submission meeting that we've talked about, but there might be subsequent meetings you have after that to talk about more specific topics. And the most important thing about the regulatory strategy plan is that it should take funding milestones into account. So an example of this might be, let's say you're building a product that has both, an intended use for adult and pediatric populations. Pediatric testing requires, significantly more testing, as everyone might know or see from the COVID vaccine approvals that are happening right now. The adults got approved much more quickly. Pediatric populations take a lot longer to get approved. So it's the same with medical devices. And so you might, strategically say, okay, we want to spend all of our money getting the adult approval and then raise another round of capital and then get the pediatric approval. So when you're coming up with your regulatory strategy plan, you should be tying it into your business and fundraising milestones. So regulatory strategy plan is the first document that basically informs the rest of the regulations and stuff that you need to be following. So there's a couple of points in the regulatory strategy plan that I want to diverge and talk about before we go on to the other boxes. The first one is this concept of regulatory pathway, or you may have heard this word, a pre-market submission. So this is the thing that you actually hand to the FDA as your application. And the idea behind this is that you're demonstrating to people that the device is safe and effective for use. So the idea behind all of this is that you're basically saying, okay, I'm going to go out and market my product, and I can't market a product that doesn't do what it says it's going to do. And so essentially there's three ways to hand an application to the FDA, three major ways for medical devices. There's other ones for drug products and things like that. But the three ways that we usually talk about are 510K, De Novo, and a PMA. 510K is the most common, and it basically clears you for this concept of pre-market notification. So giving you the ability to market your product. And the idea behind it is that it shows that your product is at least as safe and effective as something else that FDA has already cleared. So there's this concept of a predicate device. So you are basically, let's say you're making a surgical device, and you basically say, hey, FDA, you approved this other surgical device 5 years ago. Our device is very similar. Here's how it's different. And even though it's different, it's still safe because we did XYZ testing on it. So this is kind of the underlying idea behind your submission. And one of the main concepts that makes 510K easy, in addition to the fact that you're pointing to another product to justify your testing and substantial equivalence, there's also this concept that your manufacturing facility gets inspected after you start selling your product. Inspection of your manufacturing facility is something that takes a really long time. And so for these other two pathways, you have to get your inspection before you get your stamp of approval. So you can imagine that this has very big implications on your runway if you're an early stage company or you're a startup with VC capital. Let's imagine you're expecting to get your clearance for your product and then start selling your product the next day. If you are a De Novo or a PMA, you actually have to wait for FDA to come and inspect your facility. This could take anywhere from it could take, let's say, right now things are all backed up because of COVID. So let's say 3 to 6 months potentially to get your facility inspected. So you're just kind of sitting there unable to sell your product, having to pay the salary of your employees without having your facility inspected, without being able to sell anything. So understanding this stuff early really does have serious business implications for what you're doing. So 510K is the most straightforward way to get through the process, and it's the most common way of getting through.
So not to
but
interrupt, Sabrina, but
Oh,
we
yeah,
had a
no
question
problem.
that came in.
Sure.
This is as good of a segue as we're going to get. We had a question that came in about FDA pre-submission, asking, are FDA pre-submission meetings difficult to schedule, and do those typically have a long lead time themselves?
Yeah, so if we go back, they actually take, so this is a 3-month time period. So from the day that you request the meeting, it might take like a week or two to actually get it on the calendar, but it won't be for up to 60 to 90 days after your initial request, because FDA needs to review it. So yeah, these timelines are pretty long, even when you're doing the pre-submission meeting. And then when it comes to the actual submission itself, you also need to remember that it could take up to a year for FDA to like actually clear your stuff. We've been seeing all this stuff with the emergency use authorization and how fast, you know, the vaccine stuff got approved and everything. That is not the case during normal, you know, business operations for the FDA. When you submit a 510K, for example, you get 3 90-day review cycles. So the first time you submit it, they'll take 90 days to look at it. And then if there's any problems, they'll hand it back to you and they'll say, fix these problems, give it back to me. Then the clock stops. You go fix the problems, you hand it back to them. They then have another 90 days to look at it. This can happen up to 3 times before they formally reject you. So these timelines can get very long, and including them early in your, you know, master plan of your go-to-market is very important. And then even, you know, adding on top of that 1-year potential approval, if you have to get your inspection pre-clearance, so before they actually give you your approval, that can also add a significant amount of time to your approval process. So understanding your regulatory pathway early can really, you know, impact your overall project milestones. And you can imagine you're going to an investor, they're like, how long is it going to take to get to market? If you go and you tell them, you know, like 2 years start to finish and you barely have a prototype, they're not going to believe you. And this is the type of, you know, this is why they're not going to believe you. It's because the stuff takes a ridiculously long amount of time and you have to start planning for it early. So does that answer the question? I think it does.
It does, thank you.
Yeah, okay, excellent. So the other 2 types of pathways are de novo and PMA. And the idea behind them is that this is when your product is kind of a little bit more groundbreaking. And it has to do with, you know, the device classification, whether or not your device is like low, moderate risk or high risk. And we'll talk about device classification in a second, but basically these types of pathways require much more clinical data to be submitted. So you have to do much more significant and long scale testing than if you were just doing a 510K. The key takeaway from this is that regulatory pathways are not something to push off your understanding of. You should know your regulatory pathway like now, or, you know, as soon as you possibly can. And this is not the kind of thing where you should scrimp from a budget perspective. You should, you know, hire a professional regulatory person to support you or confirm your decision. Let's say you did a little bit of research and you think you have the answer, you should hire, you know, somebody to actually double check it to make sure it's right, because getting this wrong this early, you're like building your house on like a really shaky foundation. This is something you need to get right. And then when you go to the pre-sub meeting with FDA, you will present your argument as to why you think you're one of these 3 options, and then they will agree with you, or they'll say, no, there's not enough evidence for 510K, we think you're actually de novo. So it's really important that you not only, you know, figure out what you think you are, you have to then confirm it with the FDA. So there's this concept of device classes. So you may have heard this concept of like, you know, a class 2 510K. This is like probably one of the more common phrases you might hear thrown around. Because the way that FDA thinks about devices is based on risk levels. So class 1 devices are low to moderate risk. Class 2 devices are, again, like the biggest category. They're moderate to high risk devices. And these encompass like a super wide range of things. Like, you know, surgical robots are included in class 2 often. Feeding tubes, tampons, testing devices, things like that are often in class 2. Class 3 devices are those that are high risk. And a really, you know, good rule of thumb is that the majority of implantable devices, like, you know, breast implants or hip implants or stents, those you could probably just assume that you're going to be a class 3 if you're kind of an implantable device. But then other high risk devices, ventilators, pacemakers, things like that are also class 3 high risk products. And so, you know, from a perspective of tying this together with having a problem clicking my arrows here. Sorry if I'm flipping too many screens. But the idea behind this is that if you are a class 2 device, you may be a 510K or you may be a de novo, depending on whether or not there's a product out there that already that is a predicate device. If you are a class 3 device, you're automatically a PMA. So, and this one requires the most amount of testing. So there's a correlation between your risk level and then how many regulations you have to follow, and also what type of data you need to submit for your actual application. And again, all of this should be outlined in the regulatory strategy plan. This is where you really should get an expert involved to support you in these types of reviews. So the regulatory strategy plan is kind of the first document that informs the rest of what you're working on here. So the next document we talk about is one that you probably already know the majority of. It's called the indications for use and the intended use. So this is basically a document describing, what are you building and when is what you're building going to be used. So, this is an actual paragraph of text that will go into your submission. It's actually something that when you're searching for predicate devices, you actually can read other people's examples of indications for use or intended use. And this is one of the ways that we actually help you match with a predicate, is by comparing your intended use and indications for use to a product that's already been approved on the market. And again, this is something that if you're already building a product, you and your medical professional you're working with, you probably could describe this to me right now. So it's important that you document this early on and have a place that it's written down, because it's kind of the source of truth. It ties into your regulatory plan because this is the thing that you're building for. And it also has implications for the next thing. Wow, something's off here. Okay, the next thing here, which is the user needs, which is this concept of describing, basically based on what you're trying to do with the device, what do you need the device to actually do? So, if you're familiar with software development, these are kind of the equivalent of like user stories. But you're actually required to document these in a user needs document that you have to submit to FDA and keep in your design history file. It's basically a list of, what the user needs your device to do in order to perform the intended use. And so if you are already building something, there's a high likelihood that you could sit and, write this down in a way that makes sense to your team at this moment. And the way you should think about these statements is you should say, in your head, you say, as a user, in order to perform the device's intended use, I need the device to XYZ. So as a user, in order to build a surgical robot that can perform abdominal surgery, I need the device to have a range so that it can reach from the upper limits of the large intestine to the sigmoid region of the large intestine. So this is kind of an input that describes what your device needs to do in order to perform the particular type of surgery, for example, that you're working on. So this is the user needs statement. So again, user needs then tie into the requirements. So again, the requirements document is the one that we as engineers care about the most. It's the thing that allows us to actually know what we're engineering to. And requirements are probably the ones that you also might have a list of already. These are kind of the easy ones, user needs and requirements, because as engineers, you're already thinking in these terms. But requirements answer the question, in order to meet the user's needs, what characteristics does my device need to have? And so these are written in a format of, the product shall. So in the case of our surgical robot, the product shall have, an arm segment that is 2 inches long by 1 inch wide, or the product shall, be battery operated. The product shall have a touch screen. The product shall have a, voltage input of 240 volts. These are, more specific engineering requirements that you likely already know a lot of because you're already working on this product. So two of the other inputs that, or a couple of the other inputs that really matter in terms of your requirements. One of them are standard documents, and the other one is this concept of the device description and the system architecture. So now that my slides are a little out of order here. Sorry, I don't know what's wrong with here we go. All right, the device description, system architecture. So this is another document that you can probably easily write out based on what you're building already. The device description is basically, describing your device and diagramming its architecture. the architecture is most important when it comes to the software of your device. So software is kind of its own can of worms in terms of how difficult the compliance activities are for software. But one of the earliest activities you can do from a software compliance perspective is documenting your system software architecture. And from there, we'll do a little bit of risk analysis, which I'll talk about in a minute, which will help you understand, how risky the various portions of your software are, which will then inform, how much testing you need to do on each piece of your software. So for now, during pre-compliance, you should be outlining your device description, because again, FDA is going to want this in your pre-submission package. And you should also be outlining your system architecture so that we can do an assessment of, what level of concern. FDA divides software into levels of concern based on how risky your software is to the overall operation of your device. And the software system architecture will allow you to actually go through and do that type of activity. So these are also things that feed into the requirements. The other one are these standard documents. So in the regulatory strategy plan, one of the things I said that we deliver based on the type of device, the class of device you are in the regulatory pathway, there will also be a list of standards. So you may have heard this term ISO or IEC standards or ANSI standards. These are regulations in a way. They're things that you can say you're compliant to a standard, and it essentially allows you to understand, to have a good way of testing and saying, okay, I'm compliant with these standards. So for example, people who work in electronics might have heard of like RoHS testing for, environmental testing, for example. So that's an example of a consumer standard. The standards that we care about, there's one for electrical safety, which is ISO 60601-1. So there's a whole variety of standards that will be found as a result of doing your regulatory strategy plan. And these will also inform your requirements, because a standard might say something like, the device shall have a power supply separate from the on and off switch. And when you are, designing your product, let's say you designed your circuit board and the on and off switch was also the power supply, you now have to redesign your circuit board. We actually had a customer who built 500 circuit boards that did not meet the standard, and they had to throw them all away because they failed electrical safety testing. So you can imagine, again, this is like an example of not knowing all this stuff up front really has significant impacts, because you have to re-engineer your product and spend a lot more money to redesign, re-prototype, re-engineer in order to build the product that meets the requirements. So standards are one of the other things you need to look at in order to make sure you're constructing this full list of requirements for your device. Okay, so I'm gonna go through, find out where I am in my slide deck here. Okay, so one of the other chains of events that occurs, I think my arrow keys are just broken here. Sorry, everybody. All right. So one of the other chains of events that occurs that informs your requirements has to do with risk analysis. So this concept of risk analysis and risk management, it's very complicated. I'm just going to say, like, there's really no sugarcoating it. Risk management is an activity that you have to do throughout your entire life cycle. It's very complicated when you're doing it according to, fully compliant 14971 ISO standards, which is the standard that governs how you do risk management for your device. I'm going to go through an example of the types of things that this includes. But during pre-compliance, there are a little bit easier ways of thinking about risk management. But just know that risk management is an activity that is massive. It's going to go on through your entire life cycle. And if you, do some of it during pre-compliance, it's going to make it so much easier later when you transition to full compliant operations and try to do this fully according to this ISO 14971 standard. So to give you a quick little taste of what happens during 14971 style risk management, so you guys are out in California, so I'm based in New York, in Manhattan. A lot of apartments here still have radiators sitting in people's living rooms. And I like to use my radiator as an example in order to explain this concept of risk management. So you have your radiator in your living room, and the radiator gets hot. So when something's hot, the harm that can occur to somebody as a result of something being hot is you can get a burn. And the type of burn that you can get could be, not very severe, it can be super severe, it could be a first-degree burn, it could be a third-degree burn. But in general, when people get hurt, you can say that a harm has a severity level. So depending on how bad the harm is, it's less severe or it's more severe. So this is a concept associated with harms. So in our radiator example, there's also this concept that the radiator is just, sitting there. It has exposed radiator fins, which get hot, but the heat and the exposure of the fins constitutes what we call a hazard. Nothing bad has actually happened yet to cause, somebody to get hurt. It's just a hazard. It's just kind of sitting out there. So it's like, somebody's mopping the floor and they put a hazard sign saying that, the floor is wet, you could slip. You haven't actually slipped and fallen yet. You haven't actually touched the radiator yet, but it's sitting out there by itself constitutes a hazard. Something needs to occur though, in order for this hazard to actually turn into a situation that could expose the user to harm. So we call this a hazardous situation. And in the case of a radiator, it's somebody actually, coming into contact with the exposed fins. So in the same way that a harm has a severity level, so a burn could be a first-degree burn, third-degree burn, different levels of severity. Hazards and hazardous situations have different probabilities or likelihoods of occurrence. So, the likelihood that the radiator's fins are exposed is pretty high. And the likelihood that somebody leans and touches the fins is high. Maybe you say somebody's touching the fin because they trip and they fall, or somebody touches the radiator fins because they don't expect it to be hot. Those might have different likelihoods of occurrence. So let's say you have a rug might increase the likelihood that somebody's able to trip, or let's say you have a dog, or like the dog might trip somebody. Our likelihood that the hazard turns into a hazardous situation goes up, it becomes higher. So harms get analyzed in terms of their severity, hazards and hazardous situations get analyzed in terms of their probability of occurrence or likelihood of occurrence. Now, we take those two concepts and we mix them together and we come up with a risk. And there are qualitative and slightly quantitative ways of measuring the risk, which is outlined by 14971. This is where we get into like the more complicated areas of this. But, in plain English, we as engineers and we as, just people who can analyze situations, we can basically create a statement that describes the risk here without even considering these, constituent parts. We could say, there's a risk of a radiator in a room of somebody getting burned due to touching the exposed radiator fins. That sentence is much more, straightforward to understand. And so from a 14971 compliant risk management perspective, you are basically decomposing that risk sentence into its constituent parts and analyzing the likelihood that those result in the patient getting hurt or the person using your medical device getting hurt. This activity needs to be done for each risk that exists with your medical device. So it's a very systematic, very long approach in order to identify every single risk about your device. So now that you have this long list of risks, you might ask yourself, why would FDA ever let my device get cleared if it's so risky to use? Somebody could get electrocuted by touching a wire, or somebody might, get their finger stuck in this moving part. What you're required to do is to identify mitigations for each risk. So a mitigation is something that takes the risk and makes it less bad. And it can make it less bad in two ways. It can make the harm less bad. So it can take a harm from like a third-degree burn down to a first-degree burn, or it can make the likelihood that the risk actually turns into a harm. So the hazard and hazardous situation, it can take the probability or the likelihood levels and lower it. And so these are called mitigations. And as good engineers building your device, you are already thinking about risks and mitigations. You might not go into detail in a compliant way about the harm and the hazard and the probability and the severity and the likelihood, all that stuff. But what you are doing is you're saying, oh, I'm going to build this part. I'm going to make this piece a little bit thicker because if this piece breaks, it's going to cause this other thing to break. And then, the device won't function properly. And what you just did is you just identified a risk in your head and you identified a mitigation. And the important part for pre-compliance is that you keep track of the things that you're doing already in plain English to mitigate the risks of your medical device. And so we like to call these concepts risk notes. So these are notes about the risk that you have identified as an engineer going about your day-to-day engineering activity. And you also should be writing down your mitigation. And you should be linking them together in a way, like, if you're making a spreadsheet or something, you should put them next to each other. So this is the most straightforward way that you can help yourself out during pre-compliance to do this very complicated risk analysis activity that you're going to need to do during full compliance. The other activity that we recommend is doing a device safety characteristics report. So this is answering a series of questions related to the safety and the risk of your device. And then from that, we also recommend you do something called a preliminary hazards analysis, which will basically inform additional risk notes and mitigation. So it's you and your team basically sitting there and taking a critical look at your device and saying, here's all the stuff that could go wrong, and taking notes on it. And, again, coming up with mitigations. And the most important part is that those mitigations need to turn into requirements. So it's not enough to just say, my device is risky, I need to, add a cover to my radiator. You need to actually write a requirement saying that my device will have a cover on the radiator, or, my device will have a cover so somebody's hand doesn't get pinched by this moving part. Or, my device will have an insulated power input so that I don't, somebody touching the product won't get electrocuted. This is the type of thing that you need to do, and you need to demonstrate to FDA that you're doing in order to show that your device is safe for use. One note on this diagram here, you can see how everything is connected. The solid lines are connections between things that are actually required. So there's this concept called traceability that occurs in full compliance activities, where you're actually required that every mitigation, where you're actually required to demonstrate and to actually show a document showing that every mitigation you documented turns into a requirement. Every user need you documented turns into a requirement. And that's kind of, building up this concept of a trace matrix, which is something that FDA requires that you put together. Again, the key takeaway that I want you all to understand about this is that, again, risk management's hard. Compliance is hard. All this stuff is hard. You should be chipping away at this problem in baby steps during your pre-compliance phase. Write down the user needs write down the requirements write down the risks and from there, you can now collaborate with somebody who is an expert in compliance to help you add layers to the stuff that you already know about. Again, all of this is to make sure that you build the right product the first time. It's to get you that list, that full list of environments. So as we make our way through this diagram, the last thing here at the bottom is this concept of test protocol notes. So in this concept of traceability, the idea behind traceability is that you demonstrate that for everything that your user needs to perform the use of your device, you show that you have a requirement. For every way that we're making our device safe, we have a requirement. But we need to test that all of the requirements can be met by your product that you're building, and that when you build this product, your users are going to be satisfied and they're going to be able to do the thing that you intend for your device to do. So there's this conceptual map between user needs requirements and then doing this thing called testing. So during pre-compliance, we lump testing together into one concept called test protocol notes. In full compliance, there's two major types of testing. They're called verification tests and validation tests. Verification tests check. So they usually check your requirements and they check, does the device do what you designed it to do properly? So if you say the device shall have, a power supply separate from its on and off switch, you would check it by, inspecting your design to make sure that there's actually two separate things. If you say that the device has, weighs no more than 10 pounds or is battery operated, you must design a verification test to test that it's being done properly. If you design your device to meet an electrical safety standard, so remember that ISO 60601-1 electrical safety standard from before, you must verify that your device meets that standard. And you do that by sending it to a test lab. So this is another note. You can't necessarily perform all of the tests that you need to do. There are certified test labs that will need to perform some of these tests. These test labs are very expensive, so like standard electrical safety testing, 50 grand just, gone to do this testing, and around 45 days. So 50 grand, 45 days, and about 20 units of your device that will get destroyed during your electrical safety testing. So this is, to plan ahead and to understand what types of tests you need to do is very critical, again, for understanding your budget, for understanding your timeline, for understanding how much stuff you have. The way that you understand what type of testing you need to do is by figuring out all of your requirements. So again, this is where we go back to this chain. Figure out your requirements so you know what to build, then figure out your user needs so so you know what to build. But the idea here is that you also need to understand what type of testing you need to do to submit your device to FDA. The testing is determined by the requirements and the user needs. Requirements are determined by your risks. User needs are determined by indications to use. You can see how everything is tying in to get you the answers you need to understand what it's going to take to get through to your regulatory approval. So again, verification test, does the device do what it says you're going to do? And these tests could be, test lab. You could do a test on, a bench. You can do like a test in a test lab or something. One other thing to note is the tests that you do, you can't just like say, oh, my device should weigh no more than 10 pounds. You can't just get the bathroom scale out of your house and put the device on it and take a picture of the weight. These tests need to be done with calibrated equipment. So if you, as a manufacturer of your medical device, don't have this calibrated equipment, you need to send it out to get tested. But that test lab is going to want to know like what they're actually doing. So this is why you have to write test protocols or verification test protocols in order to describe how you're going to be testing these products. The
Jumping
second
in
type
here
of,
again, sorry.
oh yeah, no
Jumping
problem.
in here again, we've got a number of questions on here that would be appropriate to answer at the end of the Q&A, but we did have one question that came in that fits in nicely. Isn't ISO compliance more important for EU markets than US, which uses FDA?
Ah, this is a great question. Okay, so I think when you say ISO compliance, what you're referring to is ISO 1345. ISO 1345 is basically the equivalent of this set of regulations for FDA called 21 CFR Part 820. These have to do with the way you run your project. So all of the stuff that I'm talking about right now is the type of stuff that is covered by 21 CFR 820 and ISO 1345. ISO is a massive standards organization. There's like, thousands of tests that are not just for medical devices only, it's for lots of different, cars and stuff like this. So the 1345 is what people usually associate with Europe or the CE mark because they don't have their own set of regulations, 21 CFR Part 820. 820 is, FDA, like American regulations, but it's like 95% the same as this ISO 1345 standard. So there's lots of different ISO test types. And the one you're referring to that's specifically rated like Europe and the CE mark is 1345. I hope that answers that question. Is that clear?
So we should understand that all these testing standards are international.
Yes, they're internationally recognized. Yeah.
Okay, so the testing within verification and validation should be ISO compliant, but following ISO 1345.
No. So zoom out from testing. 1345 is a standard that governs how you document your documentation for medical device engineering and manufacturing. It is one of many standards that exists from ISO. ISO is the International Standards Organization. So I think the original question was, can you repeat it again? It was ISO is concerned more with European stuff.
Isn't ISO compliance more important for EU markets than US?
Yeah, so ISO compliance is, when you say the word ISO compliance, what I'm assuming you mean is 1345 because that is the one that is more relevant to Europe. 1345 is one of hundreds of standards that you should comply with for medical devices. 14971 is an example of one that the US, US recognizes both of them, but that's for risk management. ISO 60601-1 is for electrical safety. And those, standards are not, they're international, I guess. So this is a tricky topic. how can I best explain this? You could try to, like, the idea is that you're basically like taking a shortcut by using a standard. So you're saying my device is compliant to electrical safety standard ISO 60601-1. The United States doesn't specifically say you need to test to this standard. The United States says your device must be electrically safe. And the industry agrees that in order to demonstrate electrical safety, you comply with this international standard. So in the US, you also do comply with ISO standards. The one that is most particular to Europe and the CE mark is one particular standard called 1345, which is basically like the European government has essentially said, instead of making our own laws like the United States did with 21 CFR 820, we just point to this standard. The United States points to a set of laws, which is almost identical to that standard. Is that making a little bit more sense?
It does to me. I suppose
Okay.
folks can continue to submit questions.
Yeah.
Have more.
Okay, cool. So I think moving on to validation, which is like, we're getting to the close to the end here. This concept of validation, and this is where, one of the biggest questions I get asked is, what type of clinical study do I have to do to get FDA approval? And the way that I answer this question is, I have no idea. Look at this diagram and help me figure out how to answer this question, because it depends on what type of device you have. But when you say a clinical study, you likely mean, maybe something with patients and stuff. But what you really mean is you're trying to validate that your device works properly. So this concept of validation testing is saying, does the device do what the user needs it to do in order to actually perform the medical intended use? So you're testing your user needs, basically. Usually these types of tests are more clinical facing. Maybe you're going to do an animal study. You're going to take a sheep or a pig and you're going to do some testing on it with your surgical device and your medical device. And that's going to be some clinical testing that you use to test your product. Maybe you need to do a patient, like a study with actual humans. Very involved type of testing. You don't always have to do it. Not mandatory to do human testing just to get FDA approval or clearance. But that is one type of testing you can do to demonstrate that your device is safe and effective. So at the end of the day, when you submit your application to FDA, you need to show my device is safe and it works. And the way you show that it's safe and that it works is by showing evidence of verification and validation testing. The way you get to the type of testing you need to do is by deriving your requirements and deriving your user needs in a very methodical way. In a methodical way that complies with ISO 1345 or 21 CFR Part 11. That's kind of describing all of the stuff that we're talking about. So validation testing is like, another really complicated type of testing. When you're doing pre-compliance, we recommend that you ignore these two concepts and just brainstorm ways that you should be doing your testing. Likely, since you're all coming from an academic institution, you've probably maybe written some papers about doing your testing. Maybe you've done some engineering tests in your lab about testing your medical device. Maybe you've even done some animal studies or cadaver studies with your devices. These are all things that will help you later on if you document them as test protocol notes and then you link them to the user needs and requirements for the things that they're testing. At the end of the day, you are required to demonstrate that you have a test that touches every single requirement and that tests every single requirement. And then you have a test that tests every single user need. And your list of tests is going to get quite long. Don't just think that, I can do a couple of cadaver surgeries and a human clinical study and be done with it. There's lots of testing and lots of different types of testing that you need to do in order to demonstrate clearance of your product. So this is this idea behind testing. Okay, so in summary, I can click here. We started with our regulatory strategy plan, which laid the foundation for what we were building, what type of regulations and what type of pathway we're going through. Then we established what it is that we're building by describing our indications for use and our user needs. We also documented some initial activities related to our device description and our system architecture. From that, we started writing our requirements. Based on what we're currently working on and what we're looking at and what we're building, we do some risk analysis activities to help bolster our requirements, to make sure we have the full list of requirements that we need to do. Then, in order to show that our device is safe and effective, we test stuff with test protocol notes. Again, the important thing to remember is that this is the baby steps training wheels version of this diagram. For each one of these boxes that exist, there's significant amounts of work that needs to be done in order to document all of the stuff properly and to do it all properly. But by doing these activities early on, you're going to get very far, and you're going to get much closer than you would if you hadn't considered any of the stuff. This will prevent you from having to redo your engineering in a significant way once you start really switching over to compliant activities. One other thing I need to note for you, because you're coming from an academic environment, doing a test in an academic setting is not sufficient data to submit to FDA. Under the regulations of 1345 and 21 CFR Part 820, you must do all of your engineering, all of the manufacturing and the testing of your device in a fashion that is compliant with regulations, meaning you have what's called a quality management system. So you have like established red tape and you're doing everything compliantly. So this is one of the things that we see a lot, especially with like check transfer institutions, is groups trying to do like a sheep study with a professor in a lab, and then thinking that study data can be used in their FDA application. You can't do that unless you've done a lot of extra steps to make sure that you're building your device in a compliant way before you go and you test your device. So just like a little word of warning, if you're planning to do any kind of expensive clinical studies near term, talk to a professional, probably us. I mean, I would recommend that you talk to us, and we can help you figure out whether or not you need to go under compliant operations before performing that test in order to not waste all that money on a test that FDA will not look at. So just one little side note here. So that being said, this is where I get a little salesy in my presentation. We talked about pre-compliance. Pre-compliance is a very complicated topic, but it is a little bit easier than doing full compliant activities. Nemedio actually has a software tool that will support you and guide you through all of these initial pre-compliance activities. And if you're interested, we're offering trial licenses to everybody who's a member of this group, so that you can start getting a leg up on your pre-compliance activities in this way. So with that, I think we can switch to questions here, Matthew.
Yeah, so thanks for that really comprehensive overview. There was a lot of really great information. Let's move over to the questions, and I'll just address them in the order that they came in. First one we have is about drugs and therapeutics. Is this process for drugs and therapeutics similar or different to medical devices?
Well, okay, all right. So there's a type of drug and therapeutic product called combination products. These are products that are part drug, part device. So let's say you're building a device that uses an existing drug or even a new drug, but it delivers it using a medical device. So let's say maybe you're doing like, a patch or something that has microneedles, or a syringe that delivers a new drug, or an auto injector for epinephrine or something. These are called combination products, and they must comply with all of these regulations plus a whole slew of other ones. If you want to write down these reference numbers, I'll give you. What we just covered is 21 CFR Part 820. If you are doing combination products that include drugs, you must also comply with 21 CFR 210 and 21 CFR 211. And all of those together allow you to build a therapeutic drug delivery or a therapeutic device drug combination product. If you are building only a drug, these same concepts from a conceptual high-level perspective, they still apply in the sense that you're required to show, documentation and risk management for your manufacturing process. But if you're only building a drug, so let's say you're building like a new type of drug only that has no device component, you are required to comply with 21 CFR 210 and 211 only. And the concepts are similar when it comes to manufacturing risk, but they are, outside of the scope of what we've covered today.
Thank you. Once again, departing from medical devices precisely, next question is, can you talk about the difference between CLIA labs, LDTs versus FDA pathway 510K.
Ooh, okay, all right. So this is, I will be completely honest, this is not my super area of expertise. But what I can share, actually, no, I know enough to, I think, answer this question, actually. So it depends on whether or not you are intending to perform the operation on behalf of your customer, or if you are selling a product to somebody to do the work themselves. So CLIA and laboratory approvals and everything, those have to do if you are a business doing the actual diagnostic testing yourself, and the thing that you deliver to a customer is the result. If you are producing a device that is the thing that actually comes to the answer, then you are a medical device. So it has to do with how you are packaging your product. If your product is, send us your blood sample and we'll do all this stuff for you, then you're subject to some of the medical device regulations, but it's more of the laboratory side of things. If you are saying, I'm going to sell a blood testing device to a hospital, or I'm going to sell a saliva testing device to a hospital, then you're very clearly a medical device. But I can't go into the specifics of the CLIA laws themselves. So schedule a call with us if you want. We have experts on the team who can help you with that. Not my area.
Sounds great. The summary that I've heard that sticks with me is CLIA is a service and 510K is a device.
That's much more succinct than how I said it.
Next and final question that we have, and please continue to submit questions if you have any further, is how are you assisting in the software development process in order to make the software as a medical device to be compliant with FDA requirements? Yeah,
software as a medical device, you are not exempt from any of this stuff. All of this stuff still applies if you are not building. The word device is very misleading. If you are building a software product that analyzes MRI images and spits out an answer, you are still a medical device. You are still required to follow this, plus other software regulations. I could give an entire talk on the special extra software stuff that you need to do here. But the idea behind software is you're kind of essentially doing the same thing. Instead of saying your requirements are the device shall be this big or it shall weigh this much, your requirements are, the device must process this information this quickly. The device shall, have multiple processors that are running this simultaneously. The device shall, have a user interface that includes XYZ. So there's lots of different stuff related to software, but the way you should think about it is it's a layer on top of all the concepts we talked about. It is not a replacement. Sorry, it's a layer on top of it. It's not something separate. It's taking all these concepts and now doing them for the software as well. And if you're a device, like a physical hardware device that also includes software, you need to do it for your whole product. And if you're software, then you just, you focus on the software, but you're not exempt from any of this stuff. Software is hard. Not gonna lie, it's extra hard.
Okay.
None of this stuff is easy. That's the other thing I want you all to know. Actually, I have one statistic for you. Most medical devices, 6.5 years and $31 million to get to market. And one of the reasons I started this company and we invented this pre-compliance concept is we think that's too long and it can be shorter. So, but that is what you're up against. That's kind of the rule of thumb for a moderately advanced medical device that includes electronics and software. So.
Thanks. And thanks for putting that all into context. It's really valuable to hear that right up front, especially. I don't want to lie to anybody. This stuff is really hard, but it's not impossible. And there are things you can do now to make it a lot easier. So that's why we're talking about all this stuff early. Well, we just hit the top of the hour, so I want to be mindful of your time. So I just want to say thanks again, Sabrina, for joining us and giving us this walkthrough on pre-compliance. If you don't mind flashing up your contact information again on the screen, that'd be really helpful.
Yes.
And once again, please expect to see the recording on the New Ventures website with the space of this next week. And the link will be mailed out to everybody who's registered for this conference. Yeah, and if you have any questions or anything like that too, we can set up some office hours or something to help you get your questions answered as well. So contact us. All right, thank you, Sabrina. Thanks, Sam, and thanks everyone who joined us this week.
Yeah, thank you
we'll
all.
See you again on the 17th. Next week, we'll be taking that week off. Thank you.
Have a
Bye.
great weekend.